Years ago, soon after Gong Ryong was born, his mother passed away. He was raised by 3 of his mother's close friends. They worked as dancers in a bar and did their best to fund Gong Ryong's education and life. As an adult, Gong Ryong became an obstetrician, spending his days focusing on women's uteruses and welcoming new lives. It's no exaggeration to say that wherever there were pregnant women in Korea, Gong Ryong was there. Through hard work, he became the chief physician for a top conglomerate, specializing in treating infertility for the chairman's son. Despite his glamorous job, Gong Ryong was still poor. One night, his life's trajectory changed when, after work, his car was rear-ended by a Rolls-Royce driven by a wealthy-looking young woman. Gong Ryong decided not to argue with her. However, he noticed she was bleeding from her groin, clearly having a miscarriage. As an obstetrician, he immediately took her to the hospital for emergency surgery. Removing her sunglasses, the woman revealed herself to be Choi Go-yoon, the daughter of a top conglomerate's chairman. Recently single and depressed, she believed there were no good men left in the world. Facing this wealthy heiress, Gong Ryong did not try to ingratiate himself, but instead spoke gently, asking her to trust her doctor. After the surgery, Choi Go-yoon was anesthetized and lost her baby. Days later, men in black stormed Gong Ryong's office, took him away, and brought him to Choi Go-yoon's father, the chairman. The chairman accused him of ending his lineage and demanded he take full responsibility. That night, the chairman's men took Gong Ryong to the seaside to kill him. However, Gong Ryong, faithful to his medical oath, argued he would make the same choice again for the patient's safety. The chairman spared him but fired him, leading to Gong Ryong being blacklisted by hospitals and unable to find work. One day, Choi Go-an visited Gong Ryong to offer compensation, aware of everything that had happened with her father. Recognizing a genuinely good man, Gong Ryong, however, resented her as he had lost his job because of her family. Despite his feelings, Choi Go-an suddenly hugged and kissed him, confessing her love. Gong Ryong was stunned and rejected her advances. However, one drunken night at a food stall, Choi Go-eun appeared again. In a moment of weakness, Gong Ryong succumbed to her embrace, and they ended up intimate. Afterward, Choi Go-eun proposed again, more directly this time. She wanted to marry Gong Ryong. Thus, the once poor Gong Ryong became the lucky son-in-law about to marry into wealth. Gong Ryong's luck continued to grow after he started dating Choi Go-eun. Soon, the conglomerate paid a staggering $70 billion to send him to space for 8 days as a space tourist. Gong Ryong was scheduled to study human sperm activity in a space laboratory. Tonight, the spacecraft carrying Gong Ryong entered its final countdown. With the ignition command from the ground, the spacecraft launched towards space. Seconds into the flight, it was struck by lightning, but fortunately, its robust build shielded it successfully, allowing it to break through and ascend into orbit. Upon entering Earth's orbit, Gong Ryong saw the blue planet from a unique perspective for the first time. The novelty of space caused him to feel airsick and even hallucinate, seeing a spacesuited corpse floating in space. Fearing he might become a floating orphan himself, he couldn't help but vomit, subsequently experiencing an airway blockage and temporarily losing consciousness. Commander Eve Kim quickly administered first aid. Given the unique conditions of space, they had just 7 minutes to save him. If Gong Ryong did not regain consciousness within that time, he would perish. Commander Eve Kim communicated in real time with the medical team on the ground. Following their instructions, she attempted to dislodge the obstruction by bracing her feet against a mechanical bar and forcefully compressing Gong Ryong's abdomen from behind. Thankfully, under Eve Kim's care, the obstruction was cleared, and Gong Ryong regained consciousness. The first thing he saw was the beautiful and composed Commander Eve Kim and her bloodied, injured toe. Eve Kim had her own story. She and a colleague from the Ground Control Center had been in a relationship, but they had to part temporarily for her space mission. Once stable, Gong Ryong contacted Control and learned that the spacesuit he had seen was not a hallucination, but it wasn't a corpse either. It was a satellite made from an abandoned spacesuit. When alone, Eve Kim came up to check on him, inserting a thermometer into his clothing. Looking into Eve Kim's eyes, Gong Ryong felt unexplainably warm, though his temperature was normal. It was then time to rest, and they disconnected communication with Earth. Gong Ryong kindly reminded Eve Kim that her toe was still bleeding. As a doctor, he fetched a band-aid and a first aid kit, then secured his feet in a safety strap and took hold of Eve Kim's foot. He discovered the wound was severe, beyond the help of a simple band-aid. Surgery was necessary to stop the bleeding. Opening the first aid kit, he took out a needle and suturing thread. However, in zero gravity, Gong Ryong struggled to steady himself and thread the needle after several attempts. Unable to watch any longer, Eve Kim took over the needle and thread, and with a commander's expertise, threaded it successfully on her first try. Gong Ryong was left with only anesthesia and suturing, but the syringe from the emergency kit was missing. As he searched everywhere for it, Eve Kim suggested he just sew without it, stating the pain was minor to her. Seeing Gong Ryong hesitate, Eve Kim was ready to do it herself, prompting Gong Ryong to finally start stitching and bandaging. The procedure went smoothly, and upon completion, Gong Ryong noticed the missing syringe floating in front of him. He carefully blew it away, stealing glances at Eve Kim's reaction. She patted his shoulder and then moved to the lower deck. Privately, Gong Ryong admired how beautiful Eve Kim's toes were. Meanwhile, his girlfriend Choi Go-eun was full of concerns. Gong Ryong's trip to space was actually a secret mission directed by the chairman, and failing it would mean he'd have to break up with his daughter. Choi Go-eun constantly worried about her boyfriend, reminiscing about their past romance where she confessed her love. But Gong Ryong only promised his loyalty and not to betray her. Her ex-boyfriend, a space scientist also in space, threatened over a phone call that he wouldn't let Choi Go-eun go if Gong Ryong didn't measure up. According to the plan, after entering Earth's orbit, the spacecraft needed to dock with the International Space Station. Following a series of procedures, the docking was successful. Before opening the hatch to meet the scientists inside the station, Gong Ryong prepared a gift he planned to give them. As they were about to open the hatch, Eve Kim's attention was drawn to some fruit flies in the cabin. She was excited to see them mating on a banana. They were live organisms that had come to space. Eve Kim quickly grabbed a magnifying glass to observe this life-creating behavior in space. Gong Ryong joined her, and according to Eve Kim, fruit fly mating could last 20 minutes, longer than humans. Watching Eve Kim's earnest joy, Gong Ryong's gaze softened. After the mating, Eve Kim carefully placed the fruit flies into a test tube, reminding Gong Ryong that creating and protecting life was paramount in space. However, Gong Ryong joked about naming the male and female fruit flies, which Eve Kim firmly declined, insisting he address her only as commander, not by her first name. After securing the fruit flies, Eve Kim opened the hatch. Following her, Gong Ryong clumsily floated out of the inner cabin, still unaccustomed to the weightlessness. Inside the space station, he met several scientists, including Kang Kang-soo, Choi Go-eun's ex-boyfriend. Gong Ryong opened the space-brought gift, revealing several flavors of ice cream. However, these melt-in-your-mouth delights secretly carried the real reason behind Gong Ryong's journey to space. Originally, the chairman's son, Choi Go-eun's brother, suffered from infertility, which greatly troubled the chairman. Recently, his daughter-in-law presented him with a report stating that in the weightlessness of space, human sperm could straighten out. She suggested sending Gong Ryong, an obstetrician, to space to secretly carry her own eggs for a fertilization experiment. After being assigned the task, Gong Ryong's first reaction was to refuse, as sending human eggs to space was against regulations. However, the chairman claimed his son's sperm had already been sent up in a cargo spacecraft, and all Gong Ryong needed to do was bring the eggs. If the chairman succeeded in having a grandson, he would seriously consider Gong Ryong's relationship with his daughter Choi Go-eun. Even though the chairman pleaded on his knees, Gong Ryong still refused. Later, Gong Ryong met with the chairman's daughter-in-law, trying to persuade her to abandon the plan. However, she was more determined than the chairman. She was a pediatrician and loved children, persistently pleading with Gong Ryong to fulfill a woman's desire to become a mother. Reluctantly, Gong Ryong agreed to carry out the secret mission. The daughter-in-law's eggs were hidden in the bottom of a vanilla ice cream container. In space, Gong Ryong distributed ice cream to everyone, choosing flavors based on their preferences. After handing them out, 2 were left, one of which was the vanilla containing the eggs. Eve Kim unexpectedly took the vanilla one, prompting Gong Ryong to chase after her to get it back. Eve Kim grew suspicious, as all personal items brought to space had to be declared. Gong Ryong insisted he had declared everything, but Eve Kim knew only 5 ice creams were declared, not including the vanilla one. In a panic, Gong Ryong lied, saying he just casually brought a small cup of ice cream. Eve Kim, suspecting hidden dangerous substances, placed the ice cream in an oven to melt it completely and verify its contents. Frantic, Gong Ryong immediately retrieved the ice cream from the oven, only to find Eve Kim pointing a gun at him. Frozen, Gong Ryong watched as Eve Kim scooped some ice cream and tested it. The results showed the ice cream was non-toxic and safe at 100%. Relieved, Eve Kim then handed Gong Ryong a spoon to eat the ice cream. To avoid exposing the secret, Gong Ryong hastily ate it. After he finished, Eve Kim snatched the ice cream container, crushed it in her hand, and reminded Gong Ryong to minimize garbage in space and seal it properly before disposal. After Eve Kim left, Gong Ryong quickly retrieved the container from the trash, opened the bottom, and discovered the eggs were missing. Unknown to Gong Ryong, the actual ice cream containing the eggs was in the hands of Choi Go-eun's ex-boyfriend. Kang Kang-soo had also obtained the chairman's son's sperm, which had been transported by the spacecraft. He was now ready to conduct embryo experiments to fertilize the eggs, arrangements secretly made by the chairman. Choi Go-eun then realized her father had deceived her boyfriend. Gong Ryong was merely a courier tasked with transporting the ice cream containing the eggs into space. He was not involved in the experiments. Clearly, the chairman did not trust Gong Ryong's abilities and had no intention of letting his daughter marry him. Gong Ryong searched the space station for the eggs, and during this time, Choi Go-eun called to reveal everything. Upon learning the truth, Gong Ryong immediately confronted Kang Kang-soo, demanding the return of the eggs. Kang pushed him away, causing Gong Ryong to clumsily tumble around the space station. Kang insulted Gong Ryong, stating he was not worthy of marrying a wealthy heiress, and advised him to give up. He suggested that he and Choi Go-eun were a much better match. Despite Kang's discouragement, Gong Ryong did not give up because he had a previous agreement with the chairman. In exchange for going to space, the chairman was to build a fertility clinic there to help those suffering from infertility. With this grand purpose, Gong Ryong spent another day on the space station. Then an alarm sounded. A female test mouse designated Mouse Number 1 was biting 2 other mice. Ground Control ordered Eve Kim to kill Mouse Number 1. However, Eve Kim, respecting life, refused to harm the mouse. Suddenly, the mouse suffered a heart attack, leaving the scientists unsure of what to do. Gong Ryong, a doctor, suggested performing open chest surgery on the mouse, similar to neonatal surgeries he had performed hundreds of times. With Eve Kim's approval, he immediately began the operation. Kang Kang-soo mocked him as he performed CPR on the mouse, whose breathing was growing fainter. However, Gong Ryong persisted, seeing the dying mouse as a reflection of his own desperate situation. Inspired, he continued the heart compressions, switching turns with Eve Kim. Perhaps driven by their shared determination, the mouse's heartbeat eventually stabilized. Watching the small life being saved, Eve Kim, moved by the moment, embraced Gong Ryong tightly and praised him as a great doctor. She even allowed him to call her by her first name affectionately. Facing Eve Kim's warm gaze, Gong Ryong felt his heart stir. The expedition team and several scientists are resting. Kang Kang-soo suggests they check the lottery results together. As the commander, Eve Kim goes to the lounge to invite Gong Ryong to join them. Gong Ryong is looking at photos of his Chaebol girlfriend, but is thinking about the moment Eve Kim hugged him earlier. After calling Gong Ryong out, the group gathers around the screen to watch the lottery show. Kang Kang-soo volunteers to get coffee for everyone. While they are focused on the lottery results, Kang Kang-soo sneaks into the lab. He plans to fertilize the eggs Gong Ryong brought. After some experiments, scientist Kang Kang-soo successfully normalizes sperm in zero gravity and injects them into 10 eggs. However, Gong Ryong comes looking for him, and Kang Kang-soo only manages to inject 7 eggs before stopping to avoid being caught. He then calls the Chaebol president to share the good news, believing all 7 eggs will successfully fertilize, promising the president 7 grandchildren. The president is thrilled. Unaware of this, Gong Ryong sneaks to the cryostorage, intending to steal the frozen eggs, but doesn't know the password. At that moment, Eve Kim announces that the expedition team will perform a spacewalk tomorrow to repair a damaged solar panel. Gong Ryong sees this as an opportunity to steal the eggs while others are distracted. Coincidentally, Eve Kim reveals that Kang Kang-soo will be performing the spacewalk, which will keep him outside for hours. Gong Ryong hurriedly asks if it's possible not to return from the walk. To his surprise, Eve Kim says spacewalks are extremely dangerous and she will participate too. Gong Ryong worries for her safety. Before going to space, Eve Kim had told him that spacewalking is akin to courting death, and even experienced astronauts prepare wills in advance. As a commander willing to face death, Eve Kim is touched by Gong Ryong's concern, though she teases him for meddling. Before the spacewalk, Eve Kim starts writing her will, while Kang Kang-soo video calls his ex-girlfriend on Earth. In the call, Choi Go-eun berates Kang Kang-soo for his shamelessness and demands he return the eggs to Gong Ryong, believing Gong Ryong should perform the task. Kang Kang-soo disagrees, intent on competing with Gong Ryong for both the eggs and Choi Go-eun's affection. Furious, Choi Go-eun curses at him profusely, which only makes him find her more attractive. As the astronauts prepare for the upcoming mission, Gong Ryong tries again to access the cryo-storage but fails to enter the correct password. He contacts a doctor friend on Earth, explaining the situation with the stolen eggs and asking for help. Hearing the sound of a centrifuge spinning near Gong Ryong, his friend warns that if the centrifuge overheats, it could explode and cause an emergency power shutdown in the space station. To prevent any danger to the experimental subjects in case of a fire, the cryo-storage would automatically open. This gives Gong Ryong an idea for a solution. He plans to use the space station's treadmill to create a fire hazard by making it overheat and trigger a fire alarm. His friend cautions that this is very risky, but Gong Ryong is determined as it is his only chance to retrieve the eggs. Meanwhile, Eve Kim has finished writing and printing her will. She notices a test tube hidden under the computer and goes to find Gong Ryong. She sees that both Gong Ryong and Kang Kang-soo's rooms have photos of Choi Go-eun, sighing at how both men are in love with the same woman. Eve Kim shows the test tube to Gong Ryong. It contains fruit flies that have mated. She is ecstatic like a child, recognizing the challenge of creating life in zero gravity. Eve Kim warns Gong Ryong not to let Kang Kang-soo know, fearing the fruit flies would be used as experimental subjects and cruelly treated. Gong Ryong promises to keep this secret and swears not to let Kang Kang-soo take anything else from him. Eve Kim hands her will to Gong Ryong, unsure if she will return safely to Earth after the mission. At that moment, the fruit flies in the test tube are about to reproduce, and Eve Kim smiles joyfully. Gong Ryong is also thrilled. As the time for the spacewalk approaches, while Eve Kim and Kang Kang-soo head to the task site, Gong Ryong goes to the cryo-storage. He calls the president's daughter-in-law on Earth, asking if she would prefer Kang Kang-soo to handle her eggs. She does not trust Kang Kang-soo but believes in Gong Ryong, a responsible gynecologist, and needs him to monitor the embryo development. With her trust and instructions, Gong Ryong resolves to retrieve the eggs at all costs. After ending the call, Gong Ryong frantically runs on the treadmill. Dressed in spacesuits, Eve Kim and Kang Kang-soo begin repairing the solar panel. Hours later, as they are nearly done, Kang Kang-soo's spacesuit glove malfunctions. Ground control orders him to return to the station immediately for safety. Eve Kim insists he return at once and takes over the remaining work alone. Kang Kang-soo heads back to the station. Simultaneously, alarms sound throughout the space station due to Gong Ryong pushing the treadmill to its limits, causing the motor to overload and spark. As Gong Ryong anticipated, the station's power is cut off, unlocking all lab equipment, including the target cryo-storage. Gong Ryong quickly retrieves the eggs from the cryo-storage and hides them in his personal music player. Since there was only smoke and no actual fire, the alarm is soon cancelled and power restored. The astronauts still inside the station do not suspect Gong Ryong. Seeing the successfully retrieved eggs, Gong Ryong is overjoyed. Eve Kim continues the final repairs alone, but accidentally lets a tool slip away. In space, any lost tool can become a projectile that might hit the station. Trying to retrieve it, she accidentally detaches from the mechanical foot restraint and starts floating in space, a dangerous situation. Using her safety tether, she manages to grab onto a solar panel to stabilize herself. But this incident punctures her glove on a part of the panel, causing severe damage. Inside the space station, colleagues attempt to pull Eve Kim back, but she is too far to reach the mechanical arm. The damage to her glove worsens, setting off alarms in her spacesuit as her oxygen levels drop. Unaware of her peril, Gong Ryong reads the will Eve Kim left him. She reminisces about her most important person, her adoptive astronaut father from America, who died during a spacewalk trying to save a colleague. He left her a letter, teaching her that all life is equal and humans are not gods, influencing her to cherish all living beings. Eve Kim's will reminds Gong Ryong to stay active, take care of the mating fruit flies and the operated-on lab rats, and most importantly, to stay put and value his own life no matter what. Alarms blare in the station, and Gong Ryong checks on Eve Kim. Unable to reach the mechanical arm and lying on a solar panel, Eve Kim struggles to stay conscious as her oxygen runs low and command center is unable to help. Suddenly, the space station's hatch opens. Defying Eve Kim's orders, Gong Ryong, a tourist, dons a spacesuit and steps into space without undergoing decompression, risking death. He moves towards Eve Kim, trying to locate a safety latch to rescue her, but can't see it due to the distance. Gong Ryong shouts to wake the nearly unconscious Eve Kim, asking her to guide him to the latch. Moved by Gong Ryong's determination and tears, Eve Kim gathers strength and directs him to the latch. Following her directions, Gong Ryong finds and secures the latch, then throws it to Eve Kim. Using the latch, Gong Ryong pulls Eve Kim back to the station, returning just as her oxygen nearly runs out. After a night of oxygen therapy and physical adjustment, Eve Kim wakes up first, recalling Gong Ryong's life-risking rescue. Gong Ryong awakens shortly after and recovers. He calls a close friend on Earth to report their safety. A friend reveals to him that just now, Gong Ryong's chaebol girlfriend, Choi Go-yoon, unilaterally announced their engagement to the media, claiming they would marry once he returns to Earth. However, Gong Ryong is not pleased with this news. Instead, he is more concerned about Commander Eve Kim's health. Both Gong Ryong and Eve Kim subsequently go to the restroom. Seeing that Eve Kim is all right, Gong Ryong smiles in relief, only to be slapped by Eve. She criticizes him, stating that as an astronaut, she is always prepared to sacrifice herself. But Gong Ryong, merely a space tourist, shouldn't be risking his life. As the commander, she cannot allow him to endanger himself. Gong Ryong apologizes and promises not to repeat such actions. Eve Kim then orders Gong Ryong to avoid any reckless behavior before returning to Earth, and even forbids him from appearing in front of her. Gong Ryong pleads, pointing out the limited size of the space station and questioning how he could perfectly avoid her. Eve Kim, unforgiving, turns away coldly. Unknown to Gong Ryong, Eve Kim, though harsh outwardly, is internally troubled, her mind filled with Gong Ryong's tender gaze. Upon hearing Eve Kim's decision, Kang Kang-soo claims that Gong Ryong's reckless actions were against regulations and deserve punishment. Gong Ryong informs Kang that he has retrieved the eggs, but Kang reveals that he had already completed the experiment and the eggs had successfully been fertilized, with 6 out of 7 embryos thriving. This deepens Gong Ryong's dejection, which is no less than Kang Kang-soo's, who has seen the news of Choi Go-yoon's engagement announcement. To avoid meeting Eve Kim, Gong Ryong goes to sleep at the other astronauts' quarters. They agree and even share their private stash of alcohol with him, telling Gong Ryong that in this quiet and lonely place, alcohol is their only joy and emotional solace. Before sleeping, the astronauts give the remaining alcohol to Gong Ryong, viewing him as a hero. Alone and in zero gravity, Gong Ryong drinks, slightly lifting his spirits. Intoxicated, Gong Ryong runs around the space station, instructing one of the scientists to develop a vaccine for Alzheimer's using mice. He then visits another cosmic scientist, Donna Lee, who, during a recent lottery result check, accidentally found a lottery ticket worth 500 billion won belonging to Kang Kang-soo. Unaware of his luck, Donna's sister advised her to sew the ticket into her underwear and claim the money once back on Earth. Following her sister's advice, Donna was about to sew the ticket into her underwear when Gong Ryong suddenly appears. Witnessing Donna picking up the ticket, and after her panicked claim that she was planning to return it to Kang, Gong Ryong advises her not to and points out that Kang Kang-soo is already wealthy. Gong Ryong promises to keep her secret in exchange for her future help without questioning his reasons. Gong Ryong sneaks into the laboratory to conduct an embryo experiment with the eggs. But due to the weightlessness, he struggles to even stand and has to abandon the experiment temporarily. Seeing Eve Kim's quarters at the end of the hallway, Gong Ryong musters his courage and enters. Eve Kim isn't asleep. They lock eyes deeply, and Gong Ryong, like a child, asks Eve Kim to praise him for saving her life. Smelling alcohol on him, Eve Kim is about to question him, but Gong Ryong speaks first, asking if it's possible for him to have feelings for her. Eve Kim looks away, but Gong Ryong continues to gaze at her intensely, realizing he has fallen for the commander before him. After a brief hesitation, Eve Kim said no. She believed the confession was only because Gong Ryong was drunk. More importantly, both had their own partners. Yet Gong Ryong spoke sincerely. He would be returning to Earth in a few days and wanted an answer before leaving. Eve Kim refused to dwell on it and pushed Gong Ryong out of her lounge. After Gong Ryong left, Eve Kim felt restless. She secretly opened the lounge door to look outside and saw that Gong Ryong had not left. Believing Eve Kim was curious about him, he forced his way in to express his feelings. Gong Ryong, an obstetrician, thought he only saw most women as pregnant, except Eve Kim, who moved his heart. Eve Kim still refused. She did not want to be involved with the fiancé of a wealthy heiress. Gong Ryong promised to end things with his affluent girlfriend upon returning to Earth. If Eve Kim was single or unsatisfied with her partner in a year, he asked for a chance. However, Eve Kim commanded that Gong Ryong must never like her, and even stated he was no match for her partner. This left Gong Ryong dejected, unaware that Eve Kim was blushing at that moment. Former Space Mission Commander Kang Tae-hee watched a photo of himself with Eve Kim and her ex-astronaut boyfriend Park Dong-ah. Kang Tae-hee had led missions with both before and had always harbored feelings for Park Dong-ah. Now, seeing Park's figure, Kang Tae-hee sighed in the car, thinking happiness was no longer his. Unexpectedly, Park Dong-ah got into the car, announcing his resignation from the ground command center. Kang Tae-hee expressed his wish for Park not to leave. Gong Ryong kept his promise and called his wealthy girlfriend, Choi Go-yoon, that day. Choi Go-yoon, misunderstanding that Gong Ryong was upset over her announcing their engagement without him, was shocked when he said he wasn't worthy of her and wouldn't marry her. This left Choi Go-yoon upset all day, yet she decided to fight for Gong Ryong, even kneeling to her father in an elevator, begging him to let her be with Gong Ryong. Her father, seeing that Gong Ryong did not love his daughter as much, advised her to focus on Kang Kang-soo, who truly cared for her. However, Choi Go-eun doubted Kang Kang-soo's space embryo experiment would succeed. The chairman's daughter-in-law reached out to Gong Ryong's friend to inquire about progress. The friend informed her that Gong Ryong had successfully retrieved the eggs, and only the experiments were needed now. She immediately felt relieved. At that moment, the chairman asked his daughter-in-law to attend a meeting hosted by scientists. The Scientific Academy had observed Kang Kang-soo's experimental results, confirming that 6 out of 7 eggs had successfully fertilized. The chairman believed he was right about Kang Kang-soo, and asked his daughter-in-law to choose between Gong Ryong and Kang Kang-soo for handling the embryo matter. Upon hearing that the fertilized eggs could be implanted tonight, she hesitated but ultimately chose Kang Kang-soo, driven by her desire to have her own children. Gong Ryong received a call from the daughter-in-law. Unaware of her decision, he was still happy, planning to start the fertilization surgery tonight. To his dismay, she ordered him to stop, fearing any issues with Gong Ryong might jeopardize Kang Kang-soo's research results. Hearing her decision, Gong Ryong felt dejected and wished he could return to Earth immediately. Eve Kim, also feeling low, opened a video call to contact her boyfriend, Park Dong-ah, but saw women's underwear scattered and Park Dong-ah in bed with Kang Tae-hee. They thought the video had ended and started getting intimate. During this, Kang Tae-hee questioned Park Dong-ah about his feelings for Eve Kim. Park Dong-ah, with a heavy tone, said Eve Kim didn't understand men. Hearing her boyfriend's betrayal, Eve Kim felt devastated and asked Gong Ryong where he hid the alcohol. Still angry, Gong Ryong lied, saying he didn't know. Eve Kim, frustrated, vented on Gong Ryong, calling men unfaithful mammals who forget everything once they undress. Gong Ryong misunderstood, thinking she was talking about him, and asked her to stop lest he be embarrassed all the way to space. Meanwhile, Kang Tae-hee, who had cheated with Park Dong-ah, contacted Eve Kim. Eve Kim, intending to scold her, ended up saying nothing. On the other end, Kang Tae-hee acted nonchalant, advising Eve Kim to adhere to her commander duties. On the other side, Mina, a scientist like Kang Kang-soo, contacted her sister on Earth. She revealed that Gong Ryong saw her pick up a lottery ticket and expressed her worries about keeping it a secret and what Kang Kang-soo might do if he found out. This conversation was overheard by another scientist, Lee Seung-jun, who learned about the lottery ticket worth 500 billion and started fantasizing about wealth. Seeing Kang Kang-soo as a king printed on money, the timid Mina decided to return the ticket to Kang Kang-soo. Just as she was about to hand it over, Lee Seung-jun intervened, distracting them with excuses. Frustrated by Kang Kang-soo's boastful attitude about his wealth, Mina angrily decided to keep the lottery ticket for herself. Lee Seung-jun secretly approached astronaut Santiago and disclosed the lottery ticket matter. Santiago, too, began to dream, imagining Kang Kang-soo glowing as the king of money, wildly throwing cash around him. Unaware of the lottery discussion, Kang Kang-soo had just finished observing the 7 fertilized eggs, which were all confirmed to be healthy. The next steps were to freeze them and transport them back to Earth. Kang Kang-soo contacted the chairman to share the good news. The chairman was overjoyed and asked Kang Kang-soo to take photos of the fertilized eggs, wanting to see his future grandchildren. Heartbroken by her boyfriend's betrayal, Eve Kim found the half bottle of alcohol Gong Ryong had hidden. The liquid inside was droplet-like, making it impossible to drink freely. Determined, Eve Kim set out to find Santiago, convinced he had smuggled the alcohol into space. Meanwhile, Kang Kang-soo had just completed the gender determination of the 7 embryos, confirming the chairman would have several grandsons and granddaughters. Kang Kang-soo sent the photos of the embryos to the chairman. At that moment, while searching for Santiago, Eve Kim burst in. Kang Kang-soo quickly placed the embryos into an incubator. Eve Kim noticed anomalies in the incubator settings, such as temperature and oxygen levels, which did not match the requirements for fruit flies, which she had thought Kang Kang-soo was studying. Seeing the embryo images on the computer, Kang Kang-soo hastily lied, claiming they were images of fruit fly cell division. With her biological knowledge, Eve Kim recognized them as human embryos. She realized Kang Kang-soo was using the fruit fly research as a cover for conducting unauthorized human egg fertilization experiments, a violation of space law. Eve Kim confronted him, stating his actions were strictly prohibited. She demanded he open the incubator and called the other astronauts. Reluctantly, Kang Kang-soo opened it, and the astronauts confirmed the contents were human embryos. Eve Kim questioned how he managed to bring human eggs to the space station and the identity of the egg donors. To keep the secret, Kang Kang-soo lied, claiming the eggs were experimental materials donated by a bank and did not mention Gong Ryong. He said he had smuggled the eggs into space, hidden under a glass bottle. As for the sperm, Kang Kang-soo falsely claimed it came from Santiago, stored as experimental sperm in the cryogenic storage. Kang Kang-soo explained his actions as an attempt to bypass animal experiments on fruit flies and mice, aiming directly to solve human infertility issues effectively. Eve Kim, a staunch principled individual, insisted on disposing of the embryos. Faced with Eve Kim's decision, Kang Kang-soo had no response strategy. Gong Ryong chased after Eve Kim, trying to convince her that the fertilized eggs already constituted life and should be allowed to decide their own fate. However, Eve Kim remained adamant about upholding bioethics and eliminating potential dangers. Emphasizing principles, she ignored resistance and dumped the embryos into a disposal unit where they were destroyed like shredded paper, turning potential life into medical waste. Witnessing this, Gong Ryong was deeply disheartened and called Eve Kim a murderer. Gong Ryong had thought of space as a mother's womb, but Eve Kim's actions made him realize it was a place of death. He even regretted his feelings for Eve Kim and retracted his confession from the previous day. Eve Kim, undeterred, contacted the ground control to report Kang Kang-soo's unauthorized human embryo experiments and requested to resign her command. Ground control decided to retain Eve Kim in her position, but removed Kang Kang-soo from the expedition team and dismissed him as an astronaut. Eve Kim also locked up the microscope Kang Kang-soo used for his research, decreeing that its use must be approved by her and that all experiments would be recorded. Unaware of these events, the chairman was still celebrating, planning for his daughter to break up with Gong Ryong, marry Kang Kang-soo, and eventually take over the corporation, passing it to her sons in the future. When Kang Kang-soo called to inform him of the events in space, the chairman was devastated and fainted. Upon awakening, he instructed his daughter to contact Gong Ryong, hoping the remaining eggs in Gong Ryong's possession could still be viable. Choi Go-yoon, his daughter, refused to follow her father's wishes, fearing Gong Ryong might also be caught. The daughter-in-law, already disappointed, decided to give up after watching a video of her love with her late husband, who had died in a construction accident. She resolved to follow her husband in death. However, Gong Ryong, still clinging to life, had 3 eggs left. With 3 days left until his return to Earth and the embryos needing 3 days to develop, tonight was his last chance. Without a microscope, Gong Ryong planned to use a micropipette to mimic the microscope's effect. The biggest challenge in zero gravity was stabilizing himself to precisely inject the sperm into the eggs. Inspired by a friend on Earth, Gong Ryong thought to have several people hold his legs and arms to stabilize his body. He immediately sought help from the other astronauts. Lee Seung-jun, having overheard Mina picking up the lottery ticket, suggested they split it 3 ways, giving 1 share to Santiago since he was returning to Earth in 3 days and could claim the prize on time. Mina reluctantly agreed. After some discussion, they decided to accept Gong Ryong's offer to hold his legs in exchange for keeping the lottery secret from Kang Kang-soo. Santiago pressed Gong Ryong for the reason behind his request. With time running out, Gong Ryong revealed his plan to conduct another human embryo experiment. The astronauts hesitated, fearing they could lose their jobs like Kang Kang-soo if discovered. Gong Ryong reminded them of the 500 billion lottery ticket, urging them not to miss out on such a large sum. Santiago, who, like the chairman's son, was infertile and longed for children, was the first to agree to help Gong Ryong. Driven by the desire for the lottery prize, Mina and Lee Seung-jun also agreed. That night, while Eve Kim slept, Gong Ryong sneaked out of the sleeping quarters, donned a spacesuit to slow down his hand movements for precise micropipette manipulation, and prepared for the procedure. Santiago and Lee Seung-jun held Gong Ryong's legs while Mina kept watch. Fixed in place, Gong Ryong successfully captured the sperm, but unfortunately, the micropipette shook during the process, puncturing and killing the first egg. With only 2 eggs left, Gong Ryong focused entirely on the second attempt, successfully attaching the egg to the pipette. However, he applied too much force, causing the sperm to escape outside the egg, thus ruining the second egg. Now, with only 1 egg left, Gong Ryong prepared for his final chance, needing to inject the sperm precisely into the center of the egg. Just as he was about to inject, Eve Kim showed up. Moments earlier, Gong Ryong had helped Eve Kim choose lab rats for an experiment, and she woke up in the middle of the night to find the rats mating. Excited to share the news with Gong Ryong and not finding him in his quarters, Eve Kim went to the other astronauts' rest area. Mina hurriedly tried to manage the situation while signaling the others inside. Hearing Eve Kim approaching, Santiago and Lee Seung-jun quickly hid Gong Ryong and the embryo. When Eve Kim entered and accused them of drinking, they lied about not seeing Gong Ryong. As Eve Kim was about to inspect the area where Gong Ryong was hidden, Lee Seung-jun intervened, admitting they had been drinking and apologized, which thankfully diverted Eve Kim's attention and diffused the crisis. After Eve Kim left, Gong Ryong continued with the final experiment. He aligned the egg between the tips of 2 pipettes, positioning it in the center of the petri dish. Everyone held their breath as Gong Ryong, under great pressure, maintained absolute calm and perfectly injected the sperm into the egg. The moment the task was completed, Gong Ryong felt a huge sense of relief. Now, all he had to do was wait for the fertilized egg to develop into an embryo. During the waiting period, Gong Ryong joined Eve Kim to observe the mating progress of the lab rats. Seeing Eve Kim happy about the rats mating, Gong Ryong felt his heart stir again. Before going to space, Eve Kim recalled how the ground control center had asked her to look after Gong Ryong, a tourist. Eve Kim immediately refused, believing Gong Ryong knew nothing. However, now she found herself somewhat fond of him. Eve Kim's boyfriend, Park Dong-ah, witnessed on the monitor the closeness between her and Gong Ryong while observing lab rats. Thinking of their intimacy, Park Dong-ah, troubled, looked at the cigarette in his hand. At that moment, his former astronaut lover Kang Tae-hee approached. Park Dong-ah kissed Kang Tae-hee. A few days earlier, Kang Tae-hee had gone to Eve Kim's house to help turn off the TV and saw Park Dong-ah there. Upon seeing him, Kang Tae-hee immediately said flirtatiously how hot it was and took off her jacket. Park Dong-ah became intimate with her at his girlfriend's home. Now, Park Dong-ah claimed he was about to resign and had mistaken his respect for Kang Tae-hee as affection. Gong Ryong sneaked out of the rest cabin while Eve Kim was sleeping and prayed for the successful development of the fertilized eggs. After praying, Gong Ryong noticed that Eve Kim's toe was still unwrapped. Worried, he held her foot and scolded her for not taking care of her body. Eve Kim was sleeping deeply, so Gong Ryong changed the dressing himself. Seeing Eve Kim still asleep, Gong Ryong's memories inadvertently went back to a year ago when he overheard her refusing to take him at the command center. Gong Ryong had promised Eve Kim that he would not cause trouble. Yet now, seeing how much she had taken care of him, Gong Ryong realized she was right. He had indeed caused her a lot of trouble. While Eve Kim was still asleep, Gong Ryong took the chance to confess, hoping for a normal relationship back on Earth. Gong Ryong started observing the culture dish and saw the fertilized eggs developing healthily. Excited, Gong Ryong called his girlfriend's sister-in-law, the owner of the eggs, to share the good news. The fertilized eggs needed only 2 more days in the incubator to form an embryo, soon to be brought back to Earth. Before Gong Ryong's call, the sister-in-law had been in a coma after a suicide attempt. Now, perhaps driven by a strong desire to become a mother, she finally regained consciousness upon hearing the good news. The chairman, eager for a grandson, was delighted and saw Gong Ryong as a hero who saved his family. Gong Ryong joined everyone for breakfast. Unexpectedly, Eve Kim jokingly mentioned what Gong Ryong had said to her the previous night. It turned out that while Gong Ryong was changing her dressing and confessing, Eve Kim wasn't asleep. She remembered all the sweet care and words. Jealous, Kang Kang-soo angrily confronted Gong Ryong, puzzled how he managed sperm injection without a microscope. To prevent Kang Kang-soo from revealing the fertilized eggs, the astronauts quickly restrained him and told him to keep quiet. Amid the chaos, more debris drifted in space and precisely hit the adjusted orbit. The ground command center immediately issued an alert, reinstated Kang Kang-soo's astronaut position, and ordered all personnel to urgently evacuate via the escape pod. As commander, Eve Kim calmly ordered decisive action, instructing that necessary biological specimens, like lab rats, be loaded onto the cargo spacecraft, and told Gong Ryong to take his personal belongings. Panicked, Gong Ryong rushed back to the incubator to retrieve the fertilized eggs. Due to the emergency, the incubator was automatically locked. Gong Ryong tried to pry it open. Meanwhile, Kang Kang-soo came over and urged him to give up the undeveloped eggs. Gong Ryong asked if there was a power source in a hidden spot on the escape spacecraft, since the eggs needed electricity to develop into embryos. Seeing Gong Ryong's anxious demeanor, Kang Kang-soo tried to negotiate, promising to find a power source on the escape ship, but demanded the eggs in return. Gong Ryong agreed, but insisted that Eve Kim must not know about this. After reaching an agreement, Kang Kang-soo went to pack his belongings while Gong Ryong continued desperately to pry open the incubator. Moments later, Eve Kim and several astronauts boarded the escape spacecraft. Space debris approached with greater density, creating a critical situation. Checking the crew, Eve Kim realized Gong Ryong had not boarded. As debris violently hit the spacecraft, the ground command center ordered to end the standby mode and switch to departure mode, demanding an urgent return to Earth. Gong Ryong, left alone in the main area of the spacecraft, was trapped as the impact disrupted communications between the main body and the escape pod. Gong Ryong pounded on the door, but no one could hear him. Ground control reported that the spacecraft had developed a crack, and opening the door would lead to a loss of all oxygen. Eve Kim decided to rescue Gong Ryong alone, even considering a risky spacewalk. However, ground control, especially her boyfriend Park Dong-ah, strongly opposed this, urging her to think calmly. As the situation grew more urgent, Kang Tae-hee promised to send a rescue ship for Gong Ryong later, and ordered all astronauts in the escape pod to depart immediately. Seeing the astronauts hesitate, Kang Tae-hee activated the remote emergency separation system, severing the main cabin from the escape pod and forcefully closing the hatch. Gong Ryong was desperately trying to save himself and establish communication with the escape pod, but he was unable to connect. Instead, he received a broadcast channel from Earth, playing music. As the main cabin and escape pod were forcibly separated, Gong Ryong watched the escape pod drift away. Feeling almost hopeless, unexpectedly, he then saw Eve Kim in a spacesuit, opening the escape pod and walking towards him in space. Initially, Eve Kim climbed relatively smoothly until debris appeared again, hitting the spacecraft with high density. Eve Kim quickly found a hidden space on the spacecraft to take cover. During this moment, she recalled Gong Ryong's confession. Once the debris passed, she felt relatively safe and resumed climbing rapidly, eventually reaching the front of the main cabin. As Gong Ryong and Eve Kim made eye contact at the cabin door, Eve Kim smiled. Gong Ryong, full of concern for her, was immediately relieved as she entered the main cabin. He floated towards her, tearfully embracing her and repeatedly apologizing. Eve Kim, still smiling, reminded him of his confession. She then removed her helmet, revealing her long hair, and passionately kissed Gong Ryong in space, no longer able to hide her feelings. While waiting for a ground check to avoid being seen by command center surveillance, Gong Ryong typed a message on his phone and showed it to Eve Kim, expressing that the kiss felt like a dream he didn't want to wake from. On the ground, Park Dong-ah, witnessing his girlfriend's apparent intimacy with Gong Ryong, felt agitated, and Kang Tae-hee looked on with jealousy. In space, Eve Kim and Gong Ryong were waiting for a check when the spacecraft used for evacuation exploded due to an oxygen leak. Due to this unexpected explosion, the escape device completely failed, dashing any hope for Eve Kim and Gong Ryong to return to Earth. Trapped in the main cabin, Eve Kim and Gong Ryong were almost out of options. Eve Kim contacted the ground, which planned to send a rescue spacecraft. They asked her to check the space station's power reserves. She confirmed that the solar panels were damaged, meaning power could not be generated from them, and they could only rely on emergency power. Eve Kim estimated that the emergency power would last only 2 days at most. Ground control ordered switching to emergency mode to conserve power. Eve Kim complied, planning to shut down power-consuming systems to save as much electricity as possible while waiting for rescue. News of the astronauts' emergency evacuation via the lifeboat appeared in the media. Choi Go-eun, unaware of the current situation, ordered her private airline to prepare to personally retrieve Gong Ryong. As Choi Go-eun was about to depart, news from a ground command center press briefing appeared. As the deputy director, Kang Tae-hee faced the facts, revealing that Gong Ryong and Eve Kim were trapped in space, while Kang Kang-soo and other astronauts had safely landed in foreign waters. Kang Tae-hee promised on camera that the command center would cooperate with the International Space Agency to prepare a rescue spacecraft as soon as possible. Choi Go-eun criticized Kang Kang-soo for abandoning Gong Ryong and demanded that he return to space to bring him back. Eve Kim's boyfriend, Park Dong-ah, worried about her, wanted to pilot the spacecraft himself instead of using a test dummy, prepared to risk his life for her. Kang Tae-hee strongly opposed this and slapped Park Dong-ah, arguing that it would be a suicide mission. Park Dong-ah, fearless, declared that no one, not even Kang Tae-hee, could stop him from rescuing Eve Kim. Meanwhile, in space, the fertilized egg had developed into a healthy embryo. Gong Ryong secretly hid the embryo in a test kit, unbeknownst to Eve Kim. Following the plan, Eve Kim shut down the power, switched to emergency power, and reluctantly turned off the dehumidifying equipment, which meant the temperature inside the space station would drop dramatically, now only -20 degrees Celsius. After being trapped for 30 hours, the emergency power was nearly depleted. To maintain life support, Eve Kim made a quick decision to cut off communication with the ground and the charging of spacesuits, only keeping the oxygen production system running. In her last communication with the ground, Eve Kim stated that she would not give up hope and pleaded with the ground not to give up on them. The command center was silent. Kang Tae-hee promised Eve Kim that a rescue mission would launch within 30 hours. However, due to technical issues, preparations on the ground were not yet ready. Even if they could launch in 30 hours, Eve Kim and Gong Ryong would suffocate from lack of oxygen before then. Despite this, Kang Tae-hee still refused to let Park Dong-ah replace the test dummy in space. Inside the space station, Eve Kim found 2 thermal tents. She and Gong Ryong crawled inside to stay warm. Despite this, temperatures were still critically low, and Gong Ryong's limbs had stiffened. Eve Kim handed him a bottle of alcohol, which helped him recover slightly after a few sips. Eve Kim wanted to watch a movie to pass the time, but Gong Ryong's phone was lost. She made a plan to go to the cinema with Gong Ryong back on Earth. Gong Ryong wanted to reveal his secret about experimenting with the fertilized egg, but ultimately couldn't bring himself to confess. Eve Kim started to get cramps in her feet. Concerned, Gong Ryong left his tent to massage her. Without the protection of his tent, Eve Kim worried Gong Ryong would freeze, so he ended up joining her in her tent. They huddled together for warmth. Eve Kim suggested they would be warmer without clothes. In the cramped tent, they stripped and clung to each other for warmth. Gong Ryong no longer hesitated and revealed his true purpose for going to space and the secret that the fertilized egg had developed into an embryo. Eve Kim was too weak to be upset and instead worried about the embryo's survival. If they couldn't return to Earth, 3 lives would be lost in space. She encouraged Gong Ryong not to give up, saying that even if they died, the ground would still send a ship to retrieve and implant the embryo. Gong Ryong kissed Eve Kim, comforted by being with her in such dire circumstances. Even in the face of death, he felt content. As they shared an intimate kiss in space, they had been trapped for 40 hours. The command center was urgently discussing rescue options. At that moment, Park Dong-ah appeared in the meeting room, holding a test dummy, wanting to replace it and go to space himself. Kang Tae-hee strongly objected, unwilling to let him take the risk. Inside the space station, Gong Ryong and Eve Kim had only 10 hours of survival time left. Choi Go-eun was anxious and confronted Kang Tae-hee for an explanation. She argued that tourists should be evacuated first in an emergency and demanded a definite departure time for the rescue spacecraft. When Kang Tae-hee couldn't provide a specific time, Choi Go-eun declared that she would bring Gong Ryong's 3 mothers to the command center to watch the rescue spacecraft launch until Gong Ryong was safely back on Earth. Upon hearing that Gong Ryong was trapped, the 3 mothers were extremely worried. The eldest mother accidentally started a fire in the kitchen with the gas stove. When Choi Go-eun arrived outside the shop and saw the fire, she rushed in, grabbed a fire extinguisher, and quickly put out the fire, but injured her arm in the process. Choi Go-eun was not seriously hurt, but the 3 mothers felt guilty, worrying that Gong Ryong would blame them upon his return. However, Choi Go-eun did not blame them. Instead, she invited them to the command center to support Gong Ryong together. Meanwhile, the secretary brought news that the rescue spacecraft was preparing to launch. Before departure, Kang Tae-hee instructed Park Dong-ah to control his emotions and follow the rules strictly to avoid increasing the risk of death. Park Dong-ah, regretting his affair with Kang Tae-hee, realized he truly loved Eve Kim. Kang Tae-hee gave her watch to Park Dong-ah and put it on him herself, accepting that she could not keep someone whose heart was elsewhere and hoping only for his safe return to Earth. 4 astronauts arrived at the command center, hoping to see Gong Ryong return to Earth. They had just walked a few steps when they collapsed, still unable to adjust to Earth's gravity. They were taken in wheelchairs for intravenous fluids. Kang Kang-soo's gaze fell on Choi Go-eun, making her very nervous. Park Dong-ah boarded the spacecraft, and as the countdown began, the ship started to ascend. However, as it climbed, the ship began to shake, and a mechanical arm fell off due to the vibrations. Worse news came as an alarm from the space station indicated that the life support system had been forcibly shut down, leaving Eve Kim and Gong Ryong with no oxygen. Driven by concern for Eve Kim, Park Dong-ah, using his astronaut skills, maneuvered the spacecraft's mechanical arm to successfully grasp and dock with the space station. He opened the hatch and entered the station, where the temperature had dropped to freezing. Searching inside, he found a woman's underwear floating and followed its direction to find Eve Kim. But when he opened the thermal tent, everyone who saw the scene inside was shocked. Eve Kim and Gong Ryong were naked, huddled together for warmth. At the command center, urgency filled the air. Park Dong-ah snapped back to reality and urgently called out to Eve Kim. Fortunately, Eve Kim gradually woke up, still breathing. Park Dong-ah quickly moved both of them to the rescue spacecraft and suited them up in spacesuits. Eve Kim was mostly awake and surprised to see her boyfriend, Park Dong-ah, there. Gong Ryong also woke up and spoke to his mother and girlfriend, Choi Go-yoon, via the command center. Under ground control, Park Dong-ah planned to return to Earth with Eve Kim and Gong Ryong, but they were not out of danger yet. The spacesuits, not custom-fitted, could barely protect against the violent vibrations of re-entry. Additionally, the spacecraft's control system malfunctioned, causing extreme temperatures due to friction. The three endured intense shaking and burning pain. Park Dong-ah deployed the parachute, allowing the spacecraft to land on the sea. At the same time, the signal was lost, and communication broke down. As the spacecraft disappeared from radar, the command center fell silent, fearing the worst. However, the spacecraft eventually floated up from the sea, and Park Dong-ah reported a successful rescue, sending the command center into jubilation. Choi Go-yoon and Gong Ryong's mother embraced, and inside the rescue spacecraft, Park Dong-ah and the others also celebrated their survival. Upon reaching Earth, the media bombarded them with questions. Park Dong-ah candidly revealed his relationship with Eve Kim, stating that his trip to space was not solely to rescue Gong Ryong, but to save the woman he loved most on Earth. When reporters asked about Gong Ryong and Choi Go-yoon's marriage plans, after a brief hesitation, Choi Go-yoon gave the perfect answer. She wanted to marry him right now. The media were curious about how Gong Ryong and Eve Kim survived the extremely low temperatures in the space station. In fact, Eve Kim had found several personal oxygen bottles inside the station, each lasting 15 minutes. Using only these bottles, they huddled naked in the tent, with Gong Ryong kissing Eve Kim every 15 minutes. Facing the reporters, they couldn't disclose everything about their affair, but it was clear to almost everyone what had happened between Eve Kim and Gong Ryong inside the space station. Realizing her boyfriend might have betrayed her, Choi Go-yoon stood alone, smoking. Kang Kang-soo approached, took the cigarette from her, and noticing the burn on her arm, continued to care for the woman he liked, while hinting that her suspicions might be true. Having just returned to Earth, Gong Ryong and Eve Kim needed hospital treatment to adjust to gravity. Since he had trouble undressing, Park Dong-ah offered to help him go to the bathroom. In the bathroom, Park Dong-ah changed his tone, demanding that from now on, Gong Ryong must stop being close to Eve Kim. He reminded Gong Ryong that Choi Go-yoon was his woman, and Eve Kim belonged to him. Gong Ryong did not argue, but struggled to remove his socks after Park Dong-ah left. During a visit from the chairman, Gong Ryong pretended to vomit and secretly passed the socks to him, hinting that they contained something from space. The chairman understood and found a portable cryo box in the socks, containing the developed embryo. Choi Go-yoon arrived at the hospital room, joyfully informing Gong Ryong that the embryo was very healthy. In her excitement, she kept kissing her boyfriend. Gong Ryong was somewhat resistant, prompting Choi Go-yoon to directly voice her insecurities, asking if he had done something inappropriate with Eve Kim in space. Gong Ryong did not answer directly, but advised Choi Go-yoon not to waste her time on him. He apologized for his deception and betrayal. Choi Go-yoon was instantly heartbroken, feeling pitiful. After leaving Gong Ryong's room, she hid in the stairwell and cried quietly, seen by Kang Kang-soo, who felt unworthy and sad for her but stayed back. Choi Go-yoon, gathering her spirits, returned to see Gong Ryong, declaring she would never believe his words and was convinced that Gong Ryong truly loved her. She thought his harsh words were just out of anger and to spite his distrustful father-in-law. Choi Go-yoon contacted Gong Ryong's three mothers, hoping to visit him together with them. In the hospital, Kang Kang-soo, despite not fully recovered, pushed himself in physical therapy. He stumbled toward Gong Ryong's room, removed his oxygen mask, and furiously attacked him, wishing Gong Ryong would suffocate. Eve Kim did not intervene but appeared troubled after Kang Kang-soo was pulled away. Unsure how to handle the messy situation, Park Dong-ah ran to the hospital room, kneeled before Eve Kim, and slapped himself several times. He confessed his affair with Kang Tae-hee and declared his love for Eve Kim, hoping she would forgive him. Eve Kim did not blame him, as she felt she had no right to. Gong Ryong saw everything from his room. Today was Park Dong-ah's birthday. and the astronauts celebrated for him. Staff showed surveillance footage from the command center, revealing Park Dong-ah dismantling and stealing the test dummy, insisting on going to space himself for the rescue. Moved by the touching footage, Eve Kim teared up. The Tycoon's daughter-in-law thanked Gong Ryong, saying that thanks to him, she could finally become a mother, and countless infertile couples on Earth now had hope. Gong Ryong, sad, said he was not that great, just a speck in the vast universe. The daughter-in-law encouraged him to believe that in the vast universe, he could find his true love. Eve Kim was focused on a drawing in her hand, secretly given to her by Gong Ryong in her meal tray that day. Every cute drawing was hand-drawn by Gong Ryong himself. Scenes of dating. Gong Ryong seemed to float in Eve Kim's mind. They were watching a moving film in a cinema, walking through a forest covered with fallen leaves, taking beautiful photos together, enjoying delicious food, and styling their hair. All these were activities Gong Ryong desperately wanted to complete with Eve Kim on Earth. After looking at all the drawings, Eve Kim visited Gong Ryong's hospital room. Seeing Park Dong-ah's genuine love for her had left Gong Ryong feeling downcast. Eve Kim suggested they go to a convenience store together. Both took wheelchairs to the store. At the entrance, Eve Kim and Gong Ryong ordered steaming cup noodles, savoring a sensation completely absent in space. Suddenly, Eve Kim proposed that Gong Ryong forget what happened in space. For her, the kisses and intimacy with Gong Ryong in space were like a beautiful dream. Now back on Earth, she needed to face her boyfriend, Park Dong-ah, a man who risked his life to save hers. As for Gong Ryong, he could not escape his relationship with Choi Go-eun and had duties as a fiancé in a wealthy family. They could not betray and hurt those who loved them because of a few days in space. Gong Ryong could not accept this, thinking Eve Kim's words were just an escape from her true feelings. However, Eve Kim's expression was resolute. The first plan she wanted to accomplish after being discharged was to finalize things with Gong Ryong.